Hi, my name is Sven Meyer and I'm going to present this paper which was accepted to CHI 2020. And the title of the paper is Improving Humans' Ability to Interpret Deictic Gestures in Virtual Reality. And I present this paper in behalf of my co-authors, Jens, Robin, Brighton, Valentin, Katrin and Niels. And altogether we are from the Carnegie Mellon University, the University of Stuttgart, Hamburg University of Applied Science, Macalester College, and the University of Regensburg. I started this research topic in a bit different domain than deictic gestures, and my background here on this topic is mid-air pointing. And over the course of this talk I'm going to reference back to prior work in mid-air pointing and how this now relates to deictic gestures. So first off, mid-air pointing is used to interact with computing devices already since the 1980s, where Richard Ball proposed a system put that there, where a human can interact with a pointing arm pose and a voice command with a display or any other computing device. So this means that mid-air pointing is a form of the user interacting with a computing device. But on the other hand, when we're looking at deictic pointing, this is a method how we humans interact with humans. In detail, deictic gestures are a form of nonverbal communication between humans. They can either be a substitute or an addition to a verbal explanation. So the main idea with deictic pointing is to communicate an object or place within the vicinity of conversation partners. For example, expressions like "look over there" is mostly followed by a pointing gesture in the direction where the actual place or object is. This nonverbal expression of deictic gestures can be very powerful, as it can really reduce the words needed to express ourselves in a meaningful manner. However, on the other hand, from the mid-air pointing domain, we know that it can be very hard for systems to estimate which place or object the pointer actually meant. So in a conversation, there might be follow-up questions if it was not clearly conveyed which object or place one actually meant. So now bringing in the idea of virtual reality, we can help and support conversation partners by, for instance, giving them visual clues to convey the actual point. And here, one of the early works that actually embraced virtual reality to enhance conversations is Wong and Goodwin in 2014, presented at CSCW, where they analyzed which visual feedback method is the best to convey these deictic directions expressed by deictic gestures, which then finally resulted in a better human-human interaction, as the conversation partner could understand the referenced place faster and better. And the latest paper, Embracing Virtual Reality for Deictic Gestures, was presented last year at CHI with the paper titled Warping Deictics. And the idea of the paper is to actually bend the user's or the pointer's arm in a way that it better fits the mental model of the observer, which then will result in a better approximation of the direction of the pointer. And you can see this here in this little clip, where from an observer perspective, you see the pointer pointing at different targets on the scale, and your task is to estimate where the pointer is actually pointing towards, so estimate the number on that scale. But looking closely here, the authors in this paper basically reduce pointing down to a linear task going only up and down on the scale in a linear manner. However, when we compare this task to tasks used in the mid-air pointing domain and how these result in error correction functions, we know that the underlying systematic error is not only up-down, but also left-right. We argue in this paper that we can support the observer even better when we warp the arm not only in one dimension, but also include the horizontal plane, warping the arm also left and right of the observer. So to be more precise, in the slide before I presented how in the deictic gesture domain, linear tasks on an up and down scale have been used to study the effects and to improve the observer's performance. However, in the mid-air pointing domain, systematic errors have been shown to occur in both dimensions, up, down, as well as left and right. And the clip you can see here is from a task in which we analyzed the underlying systematic errors when performing mid-air pointing gestures. And I presented these results at CHI 2018, in which we followed up on an earlier paper showcasing that actually those systematic errors do not only occur in the real world, but also, more importantly for this paper, they also occur in virtual reality. Now, one might argue that those systematic errors only occur because the system is actually evaluating where the pointer is pointing towards. And commonly, there are different types of raycasting technique used to estimate the direction of such a mid-air pointing gesture. However, when taking a closer look on those results, we see that in fact all sorts of raycasting technique all follow an underlying systematic error. So we think it's worth investigating if those systematic errors also would occur in deictic gestures, and if we can correct for those systematic errors in both dimensions, and thus improve upon prior work. So to study this in depth, we set up an experiment in virtual reality, where we had 2 participants in virtual reality at the same time, and the observer was able to see the body posture, and thus was able to estimate where the pointer is actually aiming towards. So to include the left-right effect, we placed participants in a cylinder with a radius of 4 meters. And then we displayed targets on the wall of the cylinder only visible to the pointer. Moreover, we varied the height in which the targets are displayed on the cylinder walls, as well as the distance between participants, as both are main impact factors on how well the observer can estimate the pointer's direction. The raycast of the pointer, as indicated here by a blue dashed line, was not visible to the pointer nor the observer. The pointers got no feedback on their performance, to not influence their pointing behavior. However, the raycast of the observer, indicated here as a green line, was visible to the observer, however not to the pointer. This was done in order for the observer to be precise in his or her estimation. But again, feedback on the quality of the estimation was not given to not influence the observer. So in summary, pointer and observer took turns on aiming and estimating the target's position. Over the course of the study, we varied the distance between pointer and observer in 3 different steps, as well as the rotation of the target around the pointer in the full 360 degrees, as well as the height positions of the target on the cylinder walls. While this was a within-subject design, pointer and observer kept their roles over the course of the study. In total, we recruited 14 pairs, with 19 male participants, 9 female participants, and an average age of 24.5 years. So now looking at the results for the pointer, we want to ensure that they are similar to prior work from the mid-air pointing domain, as we hypothesized that a pointer in a deictic pointing scenario would perform gestures in a similar manner as in a mid-air pointing task. And in fact, for the eye-index finger raycast, we see the exact same overall behavior, that the intersect between the raycast and the wall is a bit to the lower right of the target across all targets. Now let's look on the results of the observer, which are important to improve the observer's performance when estimating deictic gestures. First, we want to make sure that estimating deictic pointing gestures is in fact 2-dimensional. Looking at the scatter plot, we can clearly see that estimates are not only shifted on the height axis, but also on the rotation axis around the observer, giving us a clear indication that when including both dimensions, we will end up with a better estimation. Now that we know we have systematic errors in both dimensions, when estimating the pointer's directions, we look at the mid-air pointing domain and how they corrected for systematic errors. And here a function which worked quite well for us in our CHI'15 and CHI'18 paper to correct those systematic errors is a polynomial function. However, for deictic gestures, we have the rotation around the pointer involved. We found that rotations cannot be corrected for using a polynomial function. This is why in this paper, rather than fitting a polynomial function, we fit actually 2 sine waves to the data. One sine wave here is responsible to correct for the rotation error, and the other sine wave is responsible to correct for the height effect. And as a result, we know how to warp the arm not only in the up-down direction, but also in the left-right direction, to then fit the mental model of the observer better. So let me run you through how this works in detail and how this then improves the observer's performance. So first here, the pointer in blue aims at the target. And based on that, the observer makes an estimate. This is the uncorrected version. But then we have the corrected version in which the observer is getting presented the warped arm version of the pointer. We hypothesize that the observer can estimate the position better than before. And now to confirm this hypothesis and actually validate our model, we run a second study in which we compare the non-corrected, not warped arm against the warped arm version. So as already said, the main factor here will be no correction versus with correction. And the second study is split into two parts. The first part is a pure validation study where we only reduce the parameters in half to keep the study lengths manageable. And in the second part, we have a more free task, which is more game-like, where we ask the pointer to aim at an apple and the observer to pick the right apple, validating our model in a more natural environment. And for the validation study, we recruited 19 male participants and 5 female participants with an average age of 23.9 years. When looking at the results of our validation study and the scatter plot of the distance between the target and the intersect, or in other words, the estimated position of the observer, we see an overall trend that with correction performs better than without correction. Purely speaking in terms of error here in this bar chart, and by running an ANOVA here, we can confirm that we have a statistically significant reduction in error with correction. Thus, we can confirm that our model works as expected. And thus, this model will help to support the observer in estimating where the pointer actually aims towards. So to conclude this talk, we first discussed how deictic gestures are essential for human-human conversations. We hypothesized that deictic gestures are in fact two-dimensional, and we showed this in our first study. Based on the first study, we also developed a model that can improve the observer's performance on estimating deictic gestures. And with our second study, we were able to show that our model works, and we can in fact reduce the error of the observer. While we position this paper in the context of a human-human interaction, we can also see how our technique can help when interacting with NPC players in a game environment.